Social loneliness. This is the absence of a wider circle, not one specific person, but a network of people around you. You can have a partner, a family, even a close friend, and still feel this kind of loneliness if the broader web of acquaintances, casual friends, and community connections has thinned out. It often shows up after a move to a new city, after leaving a job, or after a stage of life ends, like finishing school. The strange part is that nothing dramatic has to happen for it to appear. People simply drift, schedules stop overlapping, and the casual contact that used to fill in the gaps quietly disappears. What's left is a kind of background quiet that wasn't there before, even though your closest relationships are still intact, and that quiet can be confusing precisely because nothing seems obviously wrong from the outside. Emotional loneliness. This is different from social loneliness because it isn't about how many people are around you. It's about the absence of one specific kind of closeness. Someone who truly knows you, who you can be fully honest with, who understands the parts of you that don't come up in casual conversation. You can be surrounded by people at a party, laughing, talking, fully included, and still feel completely unseen. This often happens to people who are skilled at being social, but rarely let anyone close enough to know what's actually going on underneath. The performance of connection is happening. The actual connection is not, and the gap between the two often stays invisible to everyone except the person living inside it. Loneliness in a crowd. This is the specific discomfort of feeling most alone in spaces that are full of people. A packed train, a busy office, a crowded family gathering. Logically, isolation should feel like an empty room, but for many people, the opposite is true. The presence of so many people who are not truly seeing you can feel heavier than actual solitude. Being alone in your own space allows you to simply exist. Being surrounded by people who don't know you requires constant small performances. And that gap between performing normalcy and feeling something else is where this particular loneliness lives, often unnoticed until the crowd thins out and the silence afterward feels strangely like relief. Loneliness in a relationship. This is one of the more confusing versions because it happens despite being partnered, despite technically not being single. It shows up when two people share a home, a routine, even years of history, but the emotional distance between them has grown without either person quite noticing when it started. Conversations become logistical, schedules, errands, plans, without much room left for anything deeper. The person is right there, physically present every day, and yet something that used to feel close now feels like two people living parallel lives rather than a shared one, each quietly assuming the distance is temporary. Transient loneliness. This is the short-term version that passes through almost everyone at some point, often without much warning. A quiet Sunday evening, the period right after a goodbye at an airport, the first night in an empty house after guests have left. It arrives, sits for a while, and then fades naturally once life resumes its usual rhythm. This kind of loneliness isn't a sign that anything is wrong. It's closer to a natural dip that follows certain transitions, the emotional equivalent of an echo after a loud room goes quiet. Chronic loneliness. This is the long-term version that doesn't resolve simply because time passes or circumstances shift. Unlike the transient kind, this one persists even when there are people around, even when life looks from the outside reasonably full. Researchers have found that chronic loneliness can actually change how the brain processes social situations over time, making new connections feel even harder to form, which can deepen the isolation further. It becomes less about the absence of people and more about a pattern that has settled in and started reinforcing itself, making the next attempt at connection feel slightly harder than the one before it. Existential loneliness. This is the deepest and most universal version, separate from any specific relationship or social circumstance. It's the recognition that no matter how close you are to another person, certain experiences, your own consciousness, your own perception of the world, the inside of your own mind, can never be fully shared or fully understood by anyone else. This isn't a flaw in any particular relationship. It's simply a feature of being a separate person inside your own awareness. Most people brush past this realization quickly, but it occasionally surfaces, usually during quiet, reflective moments, and when it does, it can feel surprisingly heavy, even though nothing about your actual relationships has changed at all. Nostalgic loneliness. This is the longing for a version of connection that used to exist but no longer does. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because life simply moved forward. A friend group that used to talk daily and now barely speaks. A family dynamic from childhood that has shifted as everyone got older. The loneliness here isn't about missing a person specifically, it's about missing a particular era of closeness that can't be recreated, even if all the same people were brought back into the same room, because what's missing isn't the people themselves, but the specific version of life they belong to. Loneliness after loss. This is the specific gap left behind after someone who mattered is no longer present, whether through death, distance, or the natural ending of a relationship. The loneliness here often comes in waves rather than staying constant. An ordinary moment, a song, a smell, a familiar street can suddenly bring the absence back into sharp focus. What makes this kind particularly difficult is that the loneliness is shaped exactly like the person who is missing. It isn't a general emptiness. It has a specific outline, shaped by the exact habits, voice, and presence of the person who used to fill that particular space. Anticipatory loneliness. This is the loneliness that arrives before an actual separation happens, simply from knowing it's coming. A relationship that's clearly ending but hasn't ended yet. A friend who is about to move away. The final weeks before a long-term goodbye. The mind starts preparing for the loss in advance, and that preparation itself creates a kind of premature grief, a loneliness for something that technically hasn't been lost yet but is already being mourned in pieces, quietly, long before anyone says goodbye out loud. Digital loneliness. This is the particular emptiness that follows hours of online interaction that never quite turns into real connection. Messages get exchanged, posts get liked, conversations happen across screens throughout the day, and yet something about all of it can leave a person feeling more isolated rather than less. The interactions are frequent but shallow, constant but replaceable. Unlike a phone call or a face-to-face conversation, most digital exchanges can be paused, postponed, or ended without consequence, which makes them lighter to maintain, but also less capable of filling the deeper need they're being used to substitute for. Loneliness of being misunderstood. This happens when the people around you are present and engaged, but consistently miss who you actually are. You explain something important to you, and it gets brushed aside. You express an opinion, and it gets reduced to something simpler than what you meant. Over time, a person can stop bothering to correct the misunderstanding, not because it stopped mattering, but because repeating yourself starts to feel pointless. What remains is a quieter form of loneliness, being known by name, by face, by history, but not by substance.